There was nothing quite like going to the arcades as a kid back in the 80s. They were noisy places full of smoke and other like-minded kids wanting to have a go at the latest games. Problem was, I never had enough money to play everything I wanted, so I'd just loiter the machines, watching others, waiting my turn, trying to stretch a few coins as far as possible, maybe even check the refund slots to see if I was lucky to find a few stray coins. But more often than not, I'd walk away wanting just one more go. But I didn't always get one more go. So when those same games started appearing at home, on the Commodore 64, on the Amiga, that was something to get excited about. No coins, no pressure, just load it up and keep playing. Maybe actually learn the games and get further than I ever could in the arcades. But then I'd press fire, and something felt different. Not always worse, just not quite the same. So in this series, I'm handpicking some of my favourite arcade games that made their way onto the Commodore 64 and Amiga. Not to knock the home versions, but to look at what these games really were, and how they changed when they came home. If you like this kind of thing, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe, because I'll probably be doing more of these in future videos.
Dragon's Lair, the fantasy adventure where you become a valiant knight on a quest to rescue the fair princess from the clutches of an evil dragon.
1983, and Dragon's Lair didn't just stand out. For many of us seeing this game for the first time, it looked like it came from the future. A full cartoon running inside an arcade cabinet, animated by Don Bluth. It genuinely felt like you were watching something you shouldn't be able to play. It was mesmerising. The cabinet was always packed with people staring at the screen, even at 50p a go, which felt outrageous at the time.
I hate this overpriced bullshit!
People were chucking their spending money into the machine. It felt like stepping into a fantasy film. I remember my first ever go at this back in the day. I could be Dirk the Daring, but not for long. Because underneath all that animation, it ate my 50p and kicked my ass in seconds. It was all about timing and learning the patterns, but with just 50p, I wasn't going to get very far. Left, right, sword, at exactly the right moment. Miss it, and Dirk's gone, and so was your 50p. In a sort of unusual way, that was a very thrilling memory. After that, I think I just watched other people play it. It's impressive, frustrating, and very good at taking your coins. On the Amiga, Readysoft tried to preserve that spectacle, and to be fair, they gave it a decent go. Multiple discs, 6 of them in fact, and at first glance it looks alright. Movement is smooth, presentation is solid, and for a brief moment you get a glimpse of that arcade magic again, but it doesn't take long to notice what's missing. You're still only making very limited inputs, and once you've seen the sequences there's not much left to discover. Entire scenes have been cut as well, not by choice, just by necessity. What you're left with is impressive, but quite rigid. Something you admire more than return to, yet a valiant attempt. The C64 takes a completely different approach, and it's probably the only sensible one. Instead of chasing the animation, it turns Dragon's Lair into an actual game. Separate screens, controlled gameplay sections, platforming, some combat, timing, and a pretty clear structure from start to finish. Technically, it's very clever to have even arrived on the Commodore 64 in the first place. Visually though, it's obviously going to be a step down, and this is the only time I need to mention that. From arcade, Amiga and to Commodore 64, I really don't want to batter my beloved C64 into submission. Yes, the cinematic feel of the game is gone, replaced by sprites and simplified scenes. But in losing the spectacle, it gains something else. You're actually playing it, and that's the real difference. The arcade ran on Laserdisc, full animation, streamed like a film. The Amiga tries to hold on to that, but has to cut it down to fit onto 6 discs. The C64 doesn't even attempt it. It rebuilds the idea into something that works on its own terms, even though the cassette had a beast of a reel and it took ages to load, but back then we had a fair bit of patience, I guess. So then, Same game, 3 completely different outcomes. That's the concept of today's video. But even though they had these technical differences across platforms, let's see how they hold up anyway, just out of curiosity. The arcade version is unforgettable, not because of depth, but because of what it looked like at the time. The Amiga version gets closer than you'd expect, but once the novelty fades, so does the reason to keep playing. And the C64, oddly enough, was the one I'd stick with when I was a kid. I didn't quite own an Amiga when it was released in 1989, and I certainly wasn't prepared to waste more 50p's in the arcade, so I stuck with my trusty Commodore 64 version in 1986, and eventually mastered it. Good times. Not the most impressive, but for me as a young kid, the most playable. A technical showpiece more than a game. Impressive, but limited once you've played the same game in the arcades. Less spectacle, different style, more substance. How far did you ever get on Dragon's Lair before it took your last coin? Mid-80s Sega, Yu Suzuki, and racing games as we knew them stopped being about racing, because Outrun was never really about winning, so to speak. It was about the feeling of going somewhere. After sticking in your coins, you were dropped straight into your pretty slick Ferrari, given a blonde companion, and shown the road, stretching out ahead. Music kicks in, engine roars, and off you go. Classic this. And it felt fast. It was a superb illusion, and it wasn't just because of the speed, but because of how the game unfolded in front of you. The road bends, scenery rolls past in layers, and everything flows in a way that made it feel pretty epic. 15 routes, multiple endings, and all inside something you can play in 10 minutes, if you were good enough. It's simple, but it's iconic. You're not chasing other cars, you're chasing time, weaving through traffic, trying not to throw it all away on one bad crash. And if you found the hydraulic motion cabinet, that was it. You weren't playing it, you were driving this bad boy. On the Amiga, the original Outrun conversion makes its intentions clear straight away, and that's the fact that Probe Software tried to recreate the arcade spectacle rather than rethink it. But I think we all agree that approach is where the problems begin. At first glance it looks the part. There's a bold intro, recognisable music themes, and an attempt at that layered sprite scaling the arcade was known for. For a moment it suggests something close to the real thing, then you actually play it. The visuals don't really hold up under motion. Sprites are uneven, spaced awkwardly, and the sense of depth never quite convinces. The viewpoint sits too low, making corners harder to read, and the road lacks the clarity you need at speed. Ironically, the Ferrari itself often looks less defined than on the Commodore 64. Sound follows a similar pattern. The iconic tracks, splash wave, magical sound shower, passing breeze, all technically present. The key issue, I suppose, is the playability. The speed isn't where it needs to be, but more importantly, the handling never feels right. Steering is sluggish, visibility is compromised, and the whole experience lacks that fluid, instinctive rhythm that defined the arcade. Instead of reacting naturally to the road, you're constantly compensating for it. It ends up as a technically ambitious but fundamentally flawed conversion, especially when other Amiga races like Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge 2 proved the hardware was more than capable of delivering smooth, fast gameplay. This feels like a missed opportunity. A fan-developed remake, Outrun Amiga Edition 2025, takes a different approach, prioritising smooth performance, accurate scaling, and faithful gameplay over strict replication. I gave it a whirl, and it definitely aligns far more closer with the arcade's feel than the original commercial release. But then again, that's what everyone seems to be doing with games nowadays. On the Commodore 64, Outrun actually comes in 2 versions, US Gold in 1987 and Mindscape in 1988. And both are essentially different compromises of the same style. The US Gold version keeps up the speed, but the world feels sparse and repetitive. Traffic comes in patterns, scenery lacks depth, and that smooth flow just isn't there. The Mindscape version improves presentation, I suppose, with better sprites, menus, and excellent SID music, but it's slightly slower and still can't recreate that seamless driving feel. Outrun was all about flow, road, speed, scenery, everything worked together. On the C64, unfortunately, that illusion definitely breaks. You're still driving fast, but it feels segmented, repetitive. Like you're playing parts of a journey, not living one. Still impressive for the hardware, but it never truly captures the arcade experience. In the arcade, Outrun is still exactly what it was meant to be: quick, stylish, and easy to come back to. The Amiga gets closer than most. It looks right, sounds right, and for short bursts feels right, but never quite locked in the feeling of a superb racing game, especially not when you could always just play Lotus 2. And on the Commodore 64 it did what it could, but when that smooth, continuous drive is gone, the whole experience starts to feel fragmented rather than free. Pure flow, still effortless to play. Fast and familiar, but slightly uneven. Technically solid, structurally compromised. What racing game defines your childhood? C64, Amiga, arcade, anything. Late 80s Sega, and this time they weren't interested in cruising on a nice asphalt road because Afterburner wasn't about where you were going. It was about how fast everything could happen on screen at once, and in the arcades this was pretty damn crazy. You're in the cockpit of a roaring F-14 Tomcat, missiles flying all over the place, enemy jets flooding the screen, everything moving at once. It's crazy. Lock on, fire, avoid, repeat. That's the name of the whole game really. But at that speed, with everything coming at you, it didn't need to be anything else really. I could just about hold it together as it was. And if you found the deluxe hydraulic cabinet, it added that extra bit of fun, as the whole cabinet would tilt and shift with your inputs of the throttle, just enough to reinforce what was happening on screen. I still see these cabinets at places like Play Expo and the odd arcade here and there. Most of them are usually out of order, but they're good fun if you can find one. On the Amiga, just like the C64, there are actually two versions. The earlier Activision release in 1988 and then Sega's own version in 1989. Both are trying to bring that same arcade experience home, just in slightly different ways. The Activision version gets the basics in. The enemy waves, lock-ons, things blowing up all over the place, but the movement's a bit rough, scaling's not quite there, and something just doesn't sit tight. Then Sega stepped in a year later with their own version. I must admit this one's more refined, it runs better, looks cleaner, and overall feels more put together. You can tell it's closer to what the arcade was aiming for, but even on this version the limits do start to show. You'll see that the speed isn't quite there, the intensity dips in and out, and after a while the repetition becomes much more obvious. It looks like Afterburner, it just doesn't quite have the same addictive buzz of the arcades. On the Commodore 64, again, you've got two versions, Activision in 1988 and Mindscape in 1989, and both have their own respective takes on the game. The Activision version tries to resemble the arcade but ends up feeling pretty flat. It runs, it responds, but there's very little urgency, and it does quickly become pretty repetitive. The Mindscape version improves things slightly. It's more responsive, a bit more playable overall, and the jet feels better to control. But the trade-off is even simpler visuals, and long stretches where not a lot really happens. So you've got two versions. But the US Mindscape version was always the better of the two. Afterburner originally wasn't supposed to be built around depth though, it was built around speed, pressure and constant movement. The arcade delivers that effortlessly. The Amiga can get close in short bursts but doesn't quite sustain it. And the C64, realistically, just can't produce that level of intensity. So once that speed drops off, you start to see the game for what it is. Very simple. Pure adrenaline, still delivers. Closer, but inconsistent. Playable, but stripped right back to the point of it just being a pretty dull game. These are just my opinions, but did the Amiga or C64 versions actually do Afterburner justice? Let me know in the comments.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
Mid-80s Sega again, and a very similar game to Afterburner really, but this time it's not just about speed, it's about perspective. I bloody love this game in the arcades. Welcome to the fantasy zone indeed. I'm ready. Space Harrier drops you straight into it, with a close chase camera that limits your view just enough that some threats only reveal themselves late, as everything comes at you head on, fast and constant. It's not true 3D, but it certainly felt like it back in 1985. The ground stretches out, enemies rush in from the distance, and everything moves quickly enough that you're reacting before you've fully processed what the hell is going on. Mechanically, it's simple. You just need a bit of luck and a lot of dexterity to move, shoot, avoid. That's it really, but it was a lot of fun at the time. Enemies arrive in waves, obstacles appear without warning, and at the end of each stage there's something larger than pleasant waiting to finish you off. Then it's straight into the next one. What carries it isn't any sort of complexity, but it's that constant intensity. Large sprites, bright colours, and a relentless pace create something that feels bigger than it really was, in retrospect. There was also a moving cabinet for this, exactly the same as one for Afterburner, with the same throttle controls. That's the best way to play these types of games in the arcade. On the Amiga, there's a clear attempt to keep that feeling intact, and for the most part, it does a very decent job. Much like Afterburner, it's fast, uses large sprites, and sticks closely to the arcade structure. The level flow is familiar, bosses appear as expected, and touches like the sound and stereo effects help keep it authentic. In hindsight, it doesn't take long for the limitations to come through. At speed, clarity becomes an issue. Things appear quickly, sometimes without much warning, and after a few stages you start to notice how much it leans on the same patterns. It's close to the arcade idea, just without the same impact. On the Commodore 64, much like Afterburner, there are two versions, Elite and Mindscape, both released in 1987. And even though they stick to the same structure, the feel is different almost instantly. Looking back, the perspective is there in principle, things coming towards you, but without proper scaling this time, so the depth never really convinces. But it really does try. I suppose it feels less like moving through a space and more like objects being sort of placed in front of you. Because of this, enemies can appear abruptly, obstacles are harder to judge, and there are moments where you're reacting to things you barely had time to register. It's still quick, but not always clear, and therefore much harder to play, in my opinion. But understandably, that's really what separates the games as a whole. Space Harrier was originally built around motion. The arcade hardware handles scaling, speed and layering all at once, creating that constant forward push. The Amiga gets part of the way there. It keeps the speed, holds the structure, but can't always maintain clarity. The C64 can only approximate the idea. Without proper depth, everything becomes more about reaction than perception. So yeah, it might be the same game in theory, but it's a very different experience in practice. Distinctive, fast, and still technically impressive. A strong conversion that holds together but lacks staying power. Recognisable, but loses too much of that original feel. Is Space Harrier a great game, or just a great arcade experience? Or neither? I'd be interested to see what you guys think of this one. I like it. Another late 80s arcade shooter at first glance, but R-Type quickly shows why it stands above the rest. I'm sure that this will be amongst everybody's favourite shoot-'em-up. The Force Pod is the key to this classic, an indestructible unit you can attach front or back or launch out independently, acting as both shield and weapon. Combined with the charge shot, it turned what would have been simple encounters into something far more epic. It's tough, but fair. It ate a lot of coins off me as a kid, but I guess every death was no doubt just a mistake I could have avoided, and that's what kept me addicted to this in the arcades. The The Amiga version, handled by Factor 5, keeps the most important part intact, which is how the game plays. Enemy patterns, force pod behaviour, and the way the game flows is perfectly preserved, meaning the same learn and improve approach still applied. If you was decent at this in the arcades, then it would have carried over to the Amiga. Visually, it's slightly reduced, but still clear and smooth, which matters for a game built on precision. You still get the same structured levels and the same demand for memorisation, but without that insert coin pressure, you can push further, which was superb when you were a broke 9-year-old like me at the time. Still, I didn't quite have my Amiga yet, but I first played this round at a mate's house and it was awesome. But I did have the Commodore 64 version, and again, it keeps the core structure of R-Type, the force pod, charge shots, and recognisable level design I'd become familiar with, all present. I didn't notice the performance dips in busy moments as a kid as much as I probably do these days, and more importantly, wasn't even too bothered about the multi-load system. But yeah, in comparison, this version does have a little less impact overall. Enemies feel lighter, and the tension doesn't build in the same way, but there's no denying that this game was solid for the hardware. Demanding, precise, and one of the best designed shooters of its time. Faithful where it matters, keeping the core experience intact. Strong foundations, a genuinely great Commodore 64 attempt at an arcade classic. At a time when most beat-em-ups seem to always start in some unknown murky street, Golden Axe turned up in a fantasy land with barbarians, magic, and a bloke called Death Adder who'd kidnapped the king, stolen the Golden Axe, and generally made himself everyone's problem. It's built on Sega's System 16 hardware, which means big dudes, smooth animation, and multiple enemies on screen without everything stuttering all over the place. So yeah, you'll notice that the fights feel busy, but very controlled at the same time. 3 characters, each with different strengths and magic types: fire, lightning, or earth. And that magic builds by kicking little goblin fellows who stir you from your sleep for potions, which is still one of the strangest resource systems ever put in a game, but also one of the most iconic. Then you've got the mounts. Knock an enemy off a dragon or beast and suddenly the fight changes completely, letting you breathe fire or clear space quickly. It's not a deep game mechanically, but it's excellently remembered all the same. Enemies appear in controlled groups. Big dudes hit harder, and the whole thing moves at a steady pace from start to finish, if you have enough coins in your pocket. Some of you could definitely get through it on one sitting, but you could tell that this was definitely a game designed for 2 people to play together. Superb, classic arcade romp. The Amiga version follows the arcade structure closely, keeping the characters, magic system, and overall progression intact. Oh, and music provided by the awesome David Whittaker. Visually, it does a solid job recreating the look. Sprites are recognisable, environments are close, and everything is in order, which matters for a game with such a cult following. The enemy behaviour is toned down a little because the Amiga is not wanting you to put your money into a machine, so you find that overall the difficulty curve is flatter. Good for me, as it meant I got to see more of the game in fewer attempts. You might find that sometimes the spacing feels slightly off, particularly when lining up attacks or jumps, which does lead to the occasional hit that feels a bit questionable. Other than that, it still plays perfectly and was a solid conversion to the beloved Commodore Amiga. The C64 version takes a different route, scaling things back but focusing more on individual combat. By that I mean, you only really ever fight 2 people at once. Oh, and it's only a 1-player game. Madness. This time, the musician is Juro Intel, and that spiced things up a bit nicely, with his familiar electronic sounds. You do still get to choose between the original 3 iconic characters, and there's magic and mounts we're familiar with, but the reduction of how many enemies appear at once changes the pacing quite a bit. Instead of managing crowds in the other two versions, you're dealing with smaller encounters more directly, which slows the whole flow of play right down. Visually, it holds up better than expected though, with large sprites and decent animation, even if some detail and colour had to be sacrificed. But, as I briefly mentioned, the biggest issue on the C64 was co-op play, or lack thereof. No two-player mode sucked to be honest, and the multi-load sections would break things up a bit, which is never ideal in a game like this. Still, it feels like a complete game rather than a stripped-down version, just one that plays at its own pace. Strong presentation, varied combat, and built perfectly for those retro nights with the buddy. Faithful in structure, but less demanding overall. Scaled differently as expected, but surprisingly solid enough, even if slightly flawed. Now we're talking! When Double Dragon landed in 1987, a couple of years before Golden Axe, it didn't just join the beat-em-up genre of what was available, it basically defined how the rest would follow suit. Built by Technos Japan, this is apparently considered to be the spiritual and technological successor to Renegade, released a year prior, expanded into something far more complete, adding co-op, free movement, and enemies that actively try to surround you rather than just walk in a straight line. Superb music too. What a game this was back in the day. What stands out immediately is how physical everything feels. You can whack enemies, grab them, throw them into each other, twonk people behind you, or just cheese the game using nothing but your elbows. Didn't we all do that in the arcades? That back elbow becomes your best tool, letting you deal with enemies behind you without turning, but I suppose using it throughout the whole game would just be boring. Mind you, 10p was 10p back in 1987. Weapons add another layer. Bats, whips, knives, simple but effective. And in the case of the knife, sometimes borderline unfair, just not always in your favour. Oh, and if you make it through to the end while playing two-player, you know, after fighting your way through everything together, you fight each other to the death. All for the girl. Was it all worth it?
Nope.
The Amiga version gives a decent first impression, but what's with everyone's faces? I mean, yeah, these are large sprites and familiar stages we recognise from the arcades, but once you start moving your character, that's where it all falls apart. Controls feel unresponsive, hit detection is unreliable, and fights don't flow the way they should. You'll swing and miss when you shouldn't, then get hit when it doesn't make sense. I can't find anything consistent with this Amiga version. There's barely any sound to speak of either. One short sample on the title screen and then almost silence, broken up by a handful of effects that don't really match what's happening on screen. Most of the game is far too easy, then suddenly throws in moments that feel awkward rather than demanding. You can get through it quickly, but not because you mastered it, because it never really pushes you properly in the first place, and I suppose that's the problem. Everything you'd expect is technically here. Movement, weapons, and even a two-player mode, but it feels like a stripped-back version of something that should have been far better on this hardware, especially when we know what the Amiga was capable of. Disappointing, really. As for the Commodore 64 version of Double Dragon, well, it doesn't just struggle, it feels like it never really got going in the first place. There were actually two attempts, the original 1989 release by Melbourne House, and a later cartridge version from Ocean in 1991. But neither manages to deliver what made the arcade game work. At a glance it looks recognisable. The stages are there, the structure is there, even some of the background art holds up reasonably well. But the characters are awkwardly constructed using split sprites, giving them that odd cut-in-half look. and animation is limited enough that movement never feels natural. More importantly, the gameplay itself is again pretty badly stripped back. Fewer enemies, missing features, and very little variation in how fights play out. Most encounters boiling down to the same loop of hit, step back, repeat. There's no real sense of progression because most moves feel the same anyway. The controls aren't reliable, hit detection is inconsistent, and the whole thing lacks the responsiveness needed for a game like this. To make matters worse, this was clearly rushed. Even the developers acknowledged compromises, and it shows. This isn't a hardware limitation story, it's a case of something being pushed out before it was ready. These weren't just scaled down versions for the C64, these were versions that missed what made the original such an absolute classic in the first place. Defined the genre, still a very satisfying classic game. Looks alright at first glance, but definitely something missing. Struggled to maintain flow or impact on either version. Shame. Love this game, and if you've never played it before, Rolling Thunder looks fairly straightforward, side-on shooting sort of shinobi type game, and has decent but simple controls, but it definitely carried a very different feel to most arcade action type games of the time. Developed by Namco in 1986, it leaned heavily into that spy film style, with Agent Albatross moving through enemy bases like he owned the place. Doors lining the walls, danger coming from everywhere. I really love this game. You're managing limited ammo, relying on doors to restock, and constantly watching multiple planes of movement as enemies spawn from the doors and sides of the screen. Those enemy colours aren't just cosmetic either, as they'd indicate certain behaviours and threat levels from the bad guys. Movement is very much the same as Shinobi, shifting between upper and lower levels, controlling space while enemies close in from different angles. It genuinely is a superb little game, this. Oh, and despite having that visible health bar, don't worry, it can drain quickly enough to remind you that mistakes still carry weight. It's addictive, demanding, as well as worth chucking a few coins into back in the day. The Amiga version? Well, now then, this is disappointing. Despite the hardware scrolling capabilities, this version, handled by, wait for it, yes, Teatex, runs in a sort of squished reduced play window with noticeably jerky scrolling. That immediately seemed to affect the timing, which is critical in a game built around reflexes. Controls feel inconsistent, sometimes failing to register shots cleanly, and enemy behaviour loses clarity because they change the colour coding system, which removes a key layer of what we identified from the original. Guys, this isn't just nitpicking, this was a common sentiment at the time. Many people have regularly pointed out the sluggish movement, unreliable controls, and the feeling that this was more of a rushed port than something built for the hardware. Everything is technically there, but it's not a good version of Rolling Thunder whatsoever. So how would the Commodore 64 version fare? Well, as we know, it's downsizing to an 8-bit machine, and this version is clearly limited compared to the two powerhouses we've just seen. But interestingly, it definitely feels more cohesive than the Amiga attempt, that's for sure. You still get the core mechanics, ammo management, door usage, multi-level movement, yet whilst the hardware limitations mean blockier sprites and simpler animation, the structure of the game largely survives intact. It's slower, controls are especially tight, and the sound, driven by the usually stellar SID chip, is surprisingly underwhelming here. Enemy placement, progression, and general flow remain recognisable, even if it might not look pretty. But I think you'll all agree it's much more playable than the Amiga version, which says a lot. It's not pretty, and it's not smooth, but it functions. Saying all this though, I still loved this as a kid on my trusty Commodore 64. Stylish, controlled, and a great arcade game. Keeps the framework but loses everything else. Rough and limited, but the core design still shines through. Now, I did start this video saying they were all based on arcade games I loved, so why is this here? I have absolutely no idea, but I thought I should document that before Street Fighter became the series everyone remembers, the original was a much rougher, experimental starting point. Developed by Capcom in 1987, it introduced a lot of what would define the genre: 6-button combat, special moves like the Hadouken and Shoryuken, and international one-on-one fights. But the execution of what we would come to expect in the sequel, well, that wasn't quite there yet. Crazily enough, early cabinets even used pressure-sensitive buttons where hitting harder meant stronger attacks. In reality, players just ended up battering the machine, so it didn't last long. But it's crazy to watch. Check this out.
Just smash these fucking buttons. Fuck. Die. Die.
Unlike the sequel, I found that the inputs were inconsistent. Special moves were bloody difficult to execute reliably, and hit detection isn't always great. You'll land something clean and get very little back, then lose half your health in return without much warning. Important, no doubt, but far from refined. The Amiga version, handled by, oh for God's sake, yep, Teotex, keeps the basic idea, but struggles badly with execution. Very badly. Despite the Amiga's power, this runs slower than it ever should. Animation feels heavy, input delay is obvious, and fights lose any real sense of pace. Key elements are missing or reduced, some special moves are unreliable or absent, stages are limited, and audio is stripped right back to a couple of weak tracks with minimal effects. Enemy AI is all over the place. Some opponents can be beaten by repeating the same move, while others, like Sagat, swing wildly the other way, capable of ending fights in seconds with little room to respond. This wasn't just hindsight either. Reviews at the time called it out for exactly what it feels like: sluggish, inconsistent, and nowhere near what the hardware was capable of. It looks like Street Fighter, but it doesn't play like it. On the Commodore 64, things split depending on which version you're playing, and that makes a big difference. The earlier Teotex, oh for God's sake, not again, release is exactly what you'd expect from anything Teotex ever released. Blocky visuals, poor sound, missing features, and controls that don't respond properly. But the later US version by Pacific Dataworks is sort of a different story. It still has limitations, reduced stages, and even missing the final boss Sagat. But it's far more playable and definitely the better of the two, by far. Controls are now much more consistent. Special moves are actually achievable, and each fighter has their own music. Superb! Or is it? Because with all that said, it's still a stripped down version of a game that was already rough to begin with, so it's not all the Commodore 64's fault. You see, compared to the alternatives, this is at least functional, and occasionally even enjoyable. Important foundation, but inconsistent and unrefined. Sluggish, stripped back, and far below par of what it should have been. Very limited overall, but the later version showed some life. Okay guys, we'll finish up with probably my favourite arcade game of all time. This one's a bit different, because it never came to home computers, so can't compare it to the beloved Commodore machines. But I'm including it anyway, because Splatterhouse is one of those arcade games that sticks with you, whether you were ready for it or not. It's very nostalgic indeed, and pretty iconic amongst a certain set of fans. Late 80s arcades pushed boundaries, but this didn't just push them, it went all in. You've got Rick, dragged back from the brink by that mask, stumbling through what feels less like a house and more like something alive. Something that doesn't want you there, and is doing everything it can to finish the job. The combat is delightfully heavy. Every impact lands with a satisfying thud. Every weapon feels like it's doing real damage, and the game doesn't shy away from showing it. Pick up a plank, a cleaver, whatever's nearby, and things get messy very quickly. This one had so much atmosphere. Dead things move and twitch in the background. You're constantly on edge, even when nothing's directly attacking you. It wasn't just about getting through the level, it was about what you're walking through to do it. The sewer section used to scare me half to death as a kid too. Listen to these guys. They had the volume ramped up to 10 in the arcades, and the sounds used to go through me as a kid. Was it a shame that it never landed on the Amiga? Did we miss out because it never came to the Commodore 64 either? Or was it a godsend that we never got to play it outside of the arcades on those systems? Part of me is actually thinking what that could have been like at home, but realistically, it wouldn't have worked. Not like this. The scale, the detail, the sound design, the sheer weight of everything happening on screen, that's all tied to the arcade hardware. Strip that back and you don't just lose visuals, you lose the whole game. And we've seen what happens when that balance gets forced onto home systems. So in a strange way, it's probably better that the Amiga and C64 never got it. Because this is one of those rare cases where the arcade version isn't just the best version, it's the only version. That really makes sense. I know it was released on other machines, but that's another video for another channel. Distinctive, uncompromising, and built around an atmosphere the home systems would have struggled to carry. There was something about those days in the arcades that never quite leave us. The noise, the lights, the feeling of standing there watching someone else play waiting for our turn, already planning what we'd do differently when we finally got on it and lost our last 10p. More often than not, we walked away thinking we'd nearly cracked it. That next time, we'd get further. Then we'd get home, load up the version we had on our Commodore Amiga or Commodore 64, and for a moment it felt like we'd brought a piece of that back with us. Or did we? Well, that's all down to your own thoughts and views, but this was mine, and I'm thankful you was here with me for the journey. It didn't matter that it took 5 minutes to load, or that it didn't quite look the same, or sound the same, or move the same. What mattered was that it was there. You could play it whenever you wanted. No queue, no coins, no one tapping you on the shoulder because you'd been on it too long. And yes, a lot of the time it wasn't as good. Sometimes it was slower. Sometimes it was missing half the game. Sometimes it barely resembled what you remembered at all. But you played it anyway, because after a while, you stopped comparing it to the arcade version, and it just became your version of that game. The one you learned, the one you got better at, the one you actually finished. Something you probably never did in the arcade. But that's part of what made it special, because at the time, that was the closest you could get. Thanks for watching, guys. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. What was your favourite arcade game conversion, and on which system? Subscribe for more like this. Check out the playlists, and there's another video coming up next. Hopefully. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, bye for now.